Hello, good day everybody. Today is whatever it is. It's Tuesday. It's 10:30 in New York time. Philosophy Roulette number 72. Hope everyone is having a fabulous day if possible. Let's read some philosophy because it is exciting. I'm going to need a haircut one of these days. I don't know how I'm going to pull that off. It's going to be interesting. What is wrong with evolutionary causation? I would like to know what's wrong with evolutionary causation. I really would like to know that, actually. Oh, come please. I mean, there's no chance it would be short enough to read. But I'm actually very interested in knowing what someone would say about that. Alright, so I'm going to save that one for later, just on personal interest. AI in Society, Material Hermeneutics and Healy's Philosophy of Technoscience. AI in Society seems to post quite a bit. I did a paper by them. It turned out to be a editorial, but got a bunch of views, so people are interested in their content. Alright, so we've got a bunch of things. Oh, that's right. It's one of these I think it's a small font, like 2 columns, so the papers appear short, but they're really not that short. Alright, so we'll save this for maybe a minute if we can't find anything else, because we did one by them. Oh, analysis. I love you, analysis. So short. Everything's so clear. So short. And, well, not always so clear. That's unfair. But wait, where is this new one then? See, this is interesting. Sometimes, I mean, there's a question about full papers, how this works. But where did these new papers show up? This makes... Because sometimes I think it's, maybe there's a forthcoming section in the forthcoming. But you see, that one's not, I don't see this time biases on this page on the forthcoming here, so it takes them a little bit of a minute. Oh, here it is, down here. Oh, maybe the new ones are at the bottom. I don't know. Oh, okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, see, I haven't seen these new ones. Alright, interesting. Object files and unconscious perception. A reply to Quilty-Dunn with 25 downloads. That looks very promising. A wealth of cases. Well, maybe it's just popular, but is it available? It is available. Oh, happy day. It makes my life easy when there's things like this. 16 pages, but nicely double-spaced. Okay. So, that makes my life easy, so we're going to do this now. Alright. We can get ourselves back to the AI in Society very soon. They seem to publish a bit. So, if you are good enough to join me live, I always appreciate that. And if you want to follow along, you can come into the chat and type !paper. And the link to this page will pop up and you can download it just as I did. Hooray! Alright, we're up and running. So, object files and unconscious perception, a reply to Quilty-Dunn. A wealth of cases, most notably blindsight and priming under inattention or suppression, have convinced philosophers and scientists alike that perception occurs outside awareness. Yeah, it would be weird that we have to go, like, I'm going to go look at that tree out the window, which I can see, and then you go perceive the tree afterwards. That would be very, very strange. I mean, I would go with a phenomenological thing, but if you want to convince scientists, they might not take that as a evidence. In recent work, all these people, I dispute this consensus, arguing that any putative case of unconscious perception faces a dilemma. The dilemma divides how absence of awareness is established. If subjective reports are used, we face the problem of the criterion, the concern that such reports underestimate conscious experience. If object measures are used, we face the problem of attribution, the concern that the case does not involve genuine individual level perception. Quilty-Dunn, forthcoming in this journal, presents an apparently compelling example of unconscious perception due to Mitroff, Schaff, and Wynne, which he contends evades this dilemma. The case is fascinating. However, I here argue it does not escape the dilemma's clutches. The case. In Mitroff et al.'s experiment, subjects see two stationary circles at the upper corners of the screen. In each case, a single letter is displayed. The circles then move diagonally towards the screen center, subjects sometimes taking them to stream through each other, sometimes to bounce off each other. So we've got one of those old screensavers with the bouncing things in the window. The circles then stop and a single letter appears in one. Subjects must judge as quickly as they can whether it matches either original letter. After that, they make a streaming or bouncing judgment. So, ambiguous where the X and Y might cross each other. Bouncing where the X goes to here and the Y goes to the sort of goes directly below. And then streaming is where the X and Y cross each other. Okay. By using smooth, fairly rapid motion, Mitroff et al. Induced subjects to report streaming on 95% of trials. Despite this, responses were faster when the letters matched those shown in the circles directly above, as opposed to that in the opposite corner, where a streaming circle would have come from. Carefully ruling out alternative interpretations, Mitroff et al. Argued that this reflects an object-specific preview benefit, a priming effect due to the letter appearing in the same object. This suggests that subjects' object file systems represent the circles as bouncing, not streaming. Thus, Mitroff et al. Conclude object files and conscious perception can diverge. Okay, so what they're doing is they're giving you, priming you, so they're setting you up a certain way. Then they're making some sort of conscious, then they're making some sort of motion happen. And basically, through a little misdirection, they can get you to believe one thing or the other. So it's a magic trick. So this is a Penn and Teller. And Penn is doing one thing, Teller's doing the other, and we think we're more primed to end up with, they say the Y, as long as it's like directly in front, like directly above the Y, it's more likely because the cross is somehow harder to perceive, I guess. Okay, so. Following Mitroff et al., Quilty-Dunn argues that this implicates unconscious perception. His reasoning is simple. Object files representations are perceptual and therefore, and their divergence from subjects' conscious percepts demonstrate that they are unconscious. Quilty-Dunn further alleges that the dilemma noted at the outset is avoided. Here I argue that this is doubly mistaken. In the next section I explain why the problem of the criterion does arise and, as a result, why we cannot be confident that the relevant object file representations are unconscious. In Section 3, I provide two reasons why the relevant object file representations do not clearly reveal individual level perception. First, such representations belong in the first instance to working memory, not perception. Second, the problem of attribution is harder to elude than Quilty-Dunn supposes. Section 2. Are object files representations unconscious? How can we be sure that subjects are not conscious of bouncing? That is it. I mean, I love philosophy just because we get to write weird sentences like this. How can we be sure subjects are not conscious of bouncing? I mean, under any normal circumstance, we would say we are conscious of bouncing, but in philosophy, we can be not conscious of bouncing. Okay. That's a fun thing, because I'm like, bounce, bounce, bounce. Quilty-Dunn's answer is that the streaming experience which subjects describe is plainly at odds with their bouncing object files. Quilty-Dunn further claims that the problem of the criterion does not arise. This is mistaken. Concerns about response criterion are not, as Quilty-Dunn suggests, limited to circumstances where subjects fail to indicate that they have a stimulus, though they may have had dim conscious awareness of it. So they have a stimulus, although we're only dimly conscious of it. They arise wherever a subject's performance in a task is the joint production of underlying perceptual sensitivity and their response criterion. In any such case, performance may misrepresent awareness due to response biases. Just as a small aside, I mean, I watch a few streamers on Twitch, which sort of gave me the idea for this project anyway. And it is amazing how they can multitask and see so many things at once, because they're usually playing video games, which are highly visually intensive things. And then they're also reading a chat, responding to chat, reading stream information, responding to stream information. It is fascinating how multitasking we can be and actually be on top of this. So everything is always much harder than it looks. The trouble in life is making things look easy. This is not merely a theoretical point. Consider the sound-induced visual bounce effect, whereby playing a sound at the point at which the dots coincide causes a dramatic jump in the proportion of bounce versus streaming judgments, roughly 25 to 75%. Yeah, if you make a little audio indication that something's hitting, you definitely tend to notice it much more. Grove et al. Show that this effect is exclusively due to the strong influence of sound on criterion, that is, an increased tendency to say bounce as opposed to stream. Evidently, then, stream judgments cannot simply be assumed to be directly read out of what objects say. Well, I mean, who really thought that we were only visual creatures? That'd be very strange. Like, we take all, sensory data in. If stream judgments in Mitroff et al. Study reflect response biases, they would potentially be consistent with the subjects consciously seeing bouncing, and so with object files reflecting the content of consciousness after all. Such a combination of perceived bouncing and judged streaming would occur if subjects had a strong bias towards streaming responses in the relevant experimental conditions. Empirical assessment of this hypothesis is greatly complicated by the fact that Mitroff et al.'s display is ambiguous. This means that there is no straightforwardly correct answer to stream bounce question, and so no straightforward way of applying the usual tools of detection theory, which rely on classifying responses as hits and false alarms to prize apart sensitivity and bias. This is why Grove et al. Turn to what they take to be non-ambiguous displays in their study. Nevertheless, Grove et al.'s findings show that an explanation of divergence between judgments and the perception in terms of response bias must be taken seriously. As a result, the problem of criterion remains very much with us. Okay, so they're, I guess, saying that just having this picture is not entirely clear what a bounce would be, because you're having like circles on a screen is not clearly bouncing. I mean, they're not like physical balls. It's not like it looks like it's overly simplified to show what a bounce would actually be, what it consists in, when these things cross versus like bounce off each other, or are they passing under each other and then turning. So there's some sort of the video has abstracted away from what a bounce would be, so that there's no actual bounce there. It's sort of like some sort of abstract bounce, which we are primed to see because of all those old screensavers, or at least someone of age that remembers all the balls bouncing on screen. But otherwise, it's not really a bounce. It's just what we've been calling a sort of abstracted bounce. That's fine. The hypothesis just canvassed offers a way of developing blocks of validly speculative suggestion that Mitroff et al.'s findings might be due to conscious perceptual representation of a bounce being misconceptualized as a case of streaming. However, whilst this is the starkest way to understand a divergence between what is reported and what is seen, subtler possibilities also need considering. Such possibilities arise because the phenomenological situation in Mitroff et al.'s experiment is significantly more complex than it may first appear. Yeah, that's fine. Quilty-Dunn insists that the subjects predominantly had a clear, unambiguous percept of streaming. In this, he follows Mitroff et al., who note conscious percepts were reported via a dichotomous key press simply because all percepts fall into one of these categories. Each individual event is always clearly seen as one streaming or the other bouncing. However, even if under instruction subjects find it easy to classify files, it does not follow that their percepts are either binary or unidimensional. Nor does it follow from the fact that it requires other cues such as disambiguating featural information or sounds for subjects to report substantial numbers of bouncing files, that experiencing bouncing requires such cues as Quilty-Dunn contends. There are plausibly many aspects to subject experience in Metroff et al.'s experiment. In consequence, result bias need not be construed as a tendency to misconceptualize experience. It might equally reflect the tendency to report one aspect of experience over another. Yeah, so we've already decided what it means for something to be bouncing on screen, so we're applying very clearly to our conception of what bounces, but because the experiment is so since we're biased in a certain way, we're reporting our biased understanding of bouncing. I really hope all of you have had the experience of when you were a kid of having those like super bouncy little balls. They were so much fun. I should get a hold of a few of them and just find an empty room and throw them around and watch them bounce. That was fun. Here are 3 ways in which this might occur. Oh, so there's 3, not just what I was saying. It is quite possible to see something as F despite looking G, even when being F is incompatible with being G. Well, sure, you get confused. Consider the tilted penny, which is typically seen as circular due to constancy mechanisms, even whilst naturally being said to look elliptical. Okay, so I have no pennies here, but it's like you can see the surface of this pen that was here. You probably see the surface right here as a circle, but clearly on the video it is an ellipse because that's how it is. That's what it is. I wasn't holding it perpendicular to the camera. Martin, 2010, treats such look reports as comparative, reporting the existence of a contextually salient similarity between the look of an F object and the paradigm look of a G object. Metroff et al.'s dots do have a look which is saliently similar to that of streaming dots. Yeah, this is the... Okay. Their pattern of movement violates a solidity constraint that no parts of 2 distinct objects coincide in space and time. Yeah, so the bouncing aspect, they're not hitting each other, they're passing through each other and then bouncing. Combined with their rapid, smooth motion, the dots might thus look like they're streaming even whilst being seen as bouncing. These factors may likewise explain the hypothesized bias towards a streaming response. Metroff et al. Displays a depiction. As a result, subjects may see the dots bouncing while simultaneously seeing them as depicting streaming or vice versa. Another possibility is, so in this display you might be able to do both. Another possibility is that the dots themselves are neither seen to bounce nor stream, so both or neither, but nonetheless seem to depict both. Okay, so you could see both things and then just by your bias you pick which one is more salient to you. Yeah, well, so subjects may see both bouncing and streaming. This need not necessarily involve incoherent content. Numerous possibilities arise. For instance, bouncing and streaming would be coherent if a second dot, initially hidden by the first, was seen to diverge post-coincidence, or if one of the dots was seen to undergo fission at the point of coincidence. If subjects see both bouncing and streaming, in the case for unconscious perception plainly collapses, since object file representation would then partially reflect a complex conscious percept. Again, the fact that the subjects reliably classify trials as streaming, given a dichotomous question, does not entail that their percepts are themselves binary. Subjects may simply have a strong bias to report one aspect of the display over the other. These points all bring out ways in which subjects' responses may fail to fully capture their conscious experience. They thereby stress the continuing presence of the problem of criterion. They also bear on Quilty-Dunn's central methodological proposal. If a subject visually experiences F and also visually experiences G, and 3, F and G are clearly incompatible, then ceteris paribus, there is a good reason to think that the representation of G is unconscious. Wait, let me just reread this. If the experience F and also G and F and G are incompatible, so they visually experience F and visually represents G. Okay, so if it only represents G but you really experience F, then G is unconscious. Yeah, so maybe not, but it just could fail on one of the above criterion. Okay, that makes sense why there is a problem with the methodological proposal here. Even if we agree with the proposal, its application requires us to be sure that the 2 incompatible features are both represented visually as opposed to simply in judgment. Furthermore, its application requires us to be sure that the presence of both features in experience would involve incompatibility and incoherence. Yet, as the title Penny shows, there is no incompatibility as seeing an object F but looking at it looking incompatible G. So yeah, so you can see the circle, but you can see the ellipse, but you can experience an ellipse and see a circle. Likewise, as two-dimensional paintings of three-dimensional scenes show, there's no incompatibility in seeing an object as F, yet it being depicting incompatible G. Finally, we need to be open to ways in which seeing both bouncing and streaming would be perfectly coherent. For all these reasons, there is substantial room for doubt that Mitroff et al. Study involves object file representations disassociated from conscious experience. Yeah, so this paper is basically showing that a lot more judgment has to go into even what appear to be very, very simple experiments of visual reporting. Which is fair. I mean, even the simplest stuff, we tend to be have massively complex things going on in them. Sometimes, actually, it's the stuff we think is much more complicated is a lot easier to explain. There's fewer abstractions to deal with in complex cases. In these cases, you've abstracted away everything. In a very complex case, like seeing another person and understanding that shape, it's like you will just be like, evolution, and then you're done, because that is what we need to know in evolution. This stuff you have to like tear apart, like our psychology, and that's like, well, what happened in evolution that made us that way? And in that case, you've got no you lose everything very quickly, because I mean, all those explanations become unbelievably complicated. So the complex case in terms of explanation is way simpler. Object file representations perceptual. Suppose we are convinced, despite the various concerns of the last section, that the object file representations experienced in Mitroff et al. Study do not correspond to conscious experience. Is this tantamount to embracing unconscious perception? There are two reasons to think not. First, as Quilty-Dunn acknowledges, the behavioral effects in Mitroff et al. Study, as with object-specific preview benefits in general, are achieved by object files stored in working memory. Yet, working memory representations cannot be assumed to be identical to perceptual representations. Certainly, the process of storing and maintaining representations in working memory is partly independent of perception. Object representations in working memory can last up to 8 seconds, and do not seem to compete for the same resources as object representations in perception. Nonetheless, one might think that working memory representations are simply stored perceptual representations and thus provide a clear window onto perception. You might think that. I don't know why you would think that. Just be like, so we're somehow copied the entire universe of our like perception for 8 seconds. That would be very impressive. That if there was no compression or storage thing that went on in that case. In recent work, Block forthcoming rejects this assumption, arguing for a sharp distinction between object representations in mid-level vision and object representations in working memory. For Block, working memory differs in capacity, having low as opposed to high capacity limits, content being conceptual as opposed to non-conceptual, and format being discursive as opposed to iconic. If Block is right, it is far from obvious what object-specific preview benefits tell us about perceptual representation. Block's view is highly controversial. See Quilty-Dunn forthcoming for a trenchant critique. Fortunately, for present purposes, a much more minimal idea suffices, namely that working memory representations can in some cases diverge from perceptual representations. This is quite consistent with it generally being true that working memory representations are simply stored perceptual representations. Yeah, you don't need to go crazy about what exactly is going on. The minimal idea of occasional divergence between perception and working memory should not be controversial given Mitroff et al.'s results. Setting aside the points of Section 2. In Quilty-Dunn's interpretation, subjects' initial perception of bouncing comes apart from their subsequently reported conscious experience of streaming. Since their reported experience is presumably also grounded in working memory, this interpretation requires a divergence between perceptual representations and certain working memory representations. Once this is seen, however, We must consider alternative proposal in which the divergence occurs, not between initial perception and reported experience, but between initial perception and preview benefit supported object file representations in working memory. So, initial perception and preview benefit supported object files. So, yeah, there's going to be something here that's going to diverge between memory and perception. Otherwise, we wouldn't call one memory. This hypothesis denies any conflict between subjects' reports and their initial perception. It's available means Quilty-Dunn has at most made the case for unconscious working memory and not unconscious perception. Okay, so if you're going to refer to things, it's going to be in your memory because that's where you're referring to stuff. It's at least, if you can't tell the difference between perception and your working memory, then you have to at least you have to say that your reports are probably more likely or on one of those two. And so it's not unconscious perception, but it would be working memory. So the target is wrong of the claim earlier. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so that'd be an ambiguity between what it means to describe experience. That's an interesting question. Second, perhaps more importantly, we must consider whether object file representations implicated in Mitroff et al. Study are individual level. This is the process of attribution. The reason for positing such representations is the object-specific preview benefits which they provide. However, in line with the discussion of priming my 2018, the mere fact that a representation affects, for example, speeds the way that a subject responds is not sufficient grounds for attributing that representation to the individual as opposed to their brain or some psychological subsystem. The key, at least evidential, criterion for such individual attribution is, I propose, availability of the representation for guidance of intentional action. Thus, the most powerful consideration which Quilty-Dunn gives in favor of such representation being individual level is that they are routinely exploited in intentionally guided saccades. The problem, however, is that Mitroff et al.'s study is not routine. Rather, again, setting aside concerns from Section 2, it is unique in teasing apart the object file representations and working memory from representations underlying conscious and explicit report, when normally the two march in step. Okay, so because they're trying to pull these things apart, you're not getting the, you can't easily figure out where the attribution is going. Okay, not entirely sure how this is working. Given these special circumstances, it cannot be assumed that the specific object file representations evinced by Mitroff et al. Remain available for the guidance of intentional action, and so count as an individual level, disconnected as they are from consciousness and report. Indeed, the very fact that they are not reportable shows that in one respect they are not so available. Direct evidence of availability is thus needed. In its absence, the object file representations in question continue to confront the problem of attribution. Okay, so it looks like what happens is you've got these two things that are like going across each other. Whatever, can't really do this. And they're saying, well, they're individual letters, and that's what you're reporting on. But say you're looking at the whole scene in that case, and then you're reporting on the scene, not the individual level object letter, the letters at the individual object letters. Now, once you start pulling these things apart to begin with, maybe you are not actually reporting on the letters themselves, but the scene itself and what's going on there, and then you're so interpreting the scene and not where the letters are going. And that would represent a different sort of attribution of what's going on in this in the visual perception. So it wouldn't be unconscious, it would be that you're sort of interpreting the whole scene as something and then calling one part what you're seeing and one part what you didn't see. So Quilty-Dunn insists that an object file is a personal level type of mental representation, and that object files are a paradigm case of personal level perceptual representation. Understood generically, I'm happy to concede these claims. However, it is obscure why we should accept the much stronger thesis that all object files are personal level. That's right. So when you are looking at a object file, that particular letter, sure, that can be a paradigm case of personal level perception. But in this scene, why should we accept that? Why should all things be that way? It wouldn't be that way all the time. Sometimes it is. Distinguishing between generic and universal claims reveal the invalidity of Quilty-Dunn's argument, which he summarizes thus. Object files are genuine personal level perceptual representations. They can also occur unconsciously. Therefore, there's unconscious perception. Compare birds fly. Some birds are flightless. Therefore, there are flightless birds which fly. The object file representations in Mitroff et al. Study may be the cognitive equivalents of flightless birds. Yeah. So, yeah, because they can occur unconsciously. We don't know where the unconsciousness is being attributed. Once you put it into the unconscious, it may be unconscious for other reasons, and so therefore saying then you can't give it the same sort of properties as the conscious ones. Okay. In summary, Quilty-Dunn highlights a fascinating putative case of unconscious perception. Ultimately, however, it fails to avoid the problems of criterion and attribution, which beset more familiar cases. The discussion underscores just how deep the dilemma facing any alleged example of unconscious perception runs. Okay, that was fun. It's like you've got once you start saying things are unconscious, then you run into the problem of all the different theories that people have about perception. It looks like if you say something's conscious, like fine, then what you see is what you get. But the problem is once you stop being conscious about everything, then it's not what you see is what you get, because you've got memory, you've got like whole scene views versus the particular little thing that they were looking at. Maybe if it's unconscious, they were looking at something bigger and then chopping up the scene differently. And so all these once you get away from just direct experience, which of course is a funky notion in itself, but once you start doing that, it becomes water gets real murky real fast. So it's like you might think you see something under the water, but it's just not as you thought. Okay, so do I have anything else to say about this? Not really. You just got to be super, super careful just the whole consciousness thing is difficult, because once you start trying to make scientific claims, as these folks want to do and are doing, then you lose we never really had the phenomenology. We don't have the phenomenology set. So how do we actually then use the phenomenology to argue for things we don't have direct access to, the unconscious? And that's hard. But of course we use science, and the science then points us in different directions, and that's good. But as this example you can see here, it's like, well, this is bouncing, but as you can look at this picture right now on the video, this is not bouncing. It's a representation of bouncing, and then once you're doing that, it's not. You've sort of abstracted away from the concept, and then you get more and more problems. Okay, so that's it though for now. Have a good day, and I'll be back later. Thanks for watching.